The evolution of Third Reich uniforms followed a very long history of European uniforms in general, and Imperial German uniforms in particular. Evidently, the uniforms used by the German armed services are and always have been the most popular subject for investigation in the realm of military history as a whole. During the Nazi regime's 12-year rule, nearly 20 million Germans, men and women alike, and even children, wore some kind of uniform. The dramatic designs of Nazi uniforms came in a wide range of styles and colors, and they helped to show and promote the idea that Nazi Germany was a strong country that should be feared and respected. Medals, badges, pins, ribbons, and other symbols were used to advertise the wearer's skill and achievement. Nazi uniforms had a direct impact on the wearer. In many cases, it seems like they turned ordinary men and women into symbols of the state and the ideologies it stood for. Though there were different iterations of German uniforms starting from the 1860s, the Nazi uniform evolution started with two kinds of uniforms: standard uniforms, which were issued by the Wehrmacht or by the wearer personally on their own, or state-cost tailor-made uniforms. Tailor-made uniforms were often worn by officers during the time of peace and even during the first year of the conflict. But these uniforms were not only impractical, but also uncomfortable and costly to replace in the heat of battle. Standard uniforms began to take their place. And to ensure uniformity across the military, the field gray uniform was a standard issue that had a steel helmet, a side cap, a field blouse, a covering coat, trousers, and marching boots. Mountain soldiers got the same uniform, but the side hat was substituted for a mountain cap, as well as the pants and boots with long, baggy trousers with elastic leggings at the ankles and mountain boots. Mounted members of the army who rode horses were not just in the cavalry, but also in most of the other units, which still used horses for transport and scouting. These guys were outfitted with leather riding breeches and hefty riding boots. In 1935, closed combat vehicle personnel received a unique black uniform. This outfit had a black, padded beret, a two-breasted jacket, which also served as a helmet, and long, baggy trousers. This uniform, worn at first just with the vehicle, was both practical and popular. It was hard to miss the young soldier's attitude in this black beret, which was adorned with a silver skull emblem. It was well liked, so at the start of 1940, a field gray version of this uniform was given to the crews of the self-propelled guns. The German garment industry had done well to keep up with the quick pace of the armed forces, and Nazi uniforms were a remarkable blend of tradition and modernity, comfort and convenience. But it was still not enough to outfit the powerful and rising German Nazi army. This led to the Nazis using captured uniforms of the Austrian, Czechoslovak, and Polish armies. Sorted, packed, and stripped from their country markings, they were temporarily distributed to German conscripts to cover for the deficit. German uniforms in the Western Desert, on the other hand, were a different story. Germany, unlike Great Britain, France, and Italy, had no colonial empire, and when it became clear at the end of 1940 that the Wehrmacht would soon be forced to engage in a desert war, a whole spectrum of tropical clothing and gear had to be designed seemingly overnight. Without practical experience and under the pressure of time, the Germans decided to copy uniforms from nations with a colonial empire. And in February of 1941, when the first German forces arrived in Tripoli, they immediately changed out of their field drab clothes and into their tropical outfits. They tried to hide their appearance as best they could by wearing large sun hats, well-cut jackets and pants, and field boots with laces, but it was impossible to fool anybody. But they quickly learned that their quite practical clothing, which was fairly good by European standards, had nothing in common with the light and sometimes sloppy clothes of the indigenous peoples, as well as the colonial soldiers and colonial officers. It didn't take long for the German soldiers to notice the practical limitations of their somewhat restrictive clothing and pack up their sun hats, laced field boots, and form-fitting field blouses and pants. So, the German soldiers in the desert started to put together their own uniforms, which were most practical for them. From then on, a typical German desert fighter would wear a field cap and a big umbrella hat over his eyes to protect them from the sun. This included a shirt, long trousers up to the ankles or shorts, woolen socks, canvas, and leather boots. The German field blouse was still used, but the Italian Sacharina, which the German troops quickly purchased, was far more comfortable. The crews of the armored vehicles received a tropical variant of the side cap, which was better suited for use inside the tank than the field cap with the large umbrella. Over their skin, the troops wore knitted woolen waist protectors and woolen jackets as the desert temperatures dropped sharply at night. The most important thing for the German supply officers was making sure there were enough steel helmets and wool sweaters for the desert war. The rank badges were the same as on standard army uniforms, with the exception of a yellow-brown NCO lace instead of the aluminum-colored one. Formally, all ranks and officers were to wear the usual rank badges, but in practice, many officers, and even generals, kept using the rank badges that were already on their tempered uniforms. Also, the color of the arms of the service was the same as the field gray standard uniform of the Wehrmacht. As for the uniforms on the Eastern Front, when Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, started, the German uniform was mostly the same as it was at the start of the war. The soldiers did, however, get certain streamlining measures that were put in place at the onset of the war. More importantly, army uniforms started to lose the dark bluish-green badge fabric which had been worn on the field blouse and greatcoat collars, in addition to shoulder straps and the rank badges on the sleeve. Instead, field gray was now used as a badge cloth. Gray trousers were much less common when new models were made of field gray cloth, and the white or silver threads used in symbols and rank designation were substituted with a color described as mouse gray. The harsh weather conditions that the German soldiers had to endure in Russia, the lack of detergents or repair facilities, and the problems faced when bringing spare clothing to the front all led to an obvious and quick deterioration in the appearance of the German soldier on the Eastern Front. Officers, too, were affected and switched to normal standard clothes, putting away their custom-made field shirts, gray trousers, and tall boots. It was a disaster for German troops on open terrain at temperatures as low as 35 degrees below zero, with only their basic field outfits to keep them warm. Soldiers were forced to wear undershirts stuffed with newspaper and boots stuffed with straw, as no winter clothing was supplied. The second winter in Russia demanded the fabrication of a new kind of winter gear, both in its rapid development and in its mass production, which led to a modern take on the combat suit. This uniform was the first to have specialized undergarments, weather-resistant materials, and two different camo patterns on top and bottom, the white winter side and the field gray side. This uniform became the first modern combat suit, which is a worldwide standard today. Its only downside was that it was too heavy, but that is for today's standards. And for some reason, the Waffen-SS only got their own special camouflage pattern fighting outfit in the last winter of World War II. Officers on the Eastern Front wore light field blouses of linen or Red Army captured shirts during the summer months, while lower ranks wore a range of different labor attire. Open collars were acceptable summer uniforms for the German military over time. From 1943 on, the different collarless shirts worn by German soldiers on the Eastern Front were replaced by a field gray standard model. Protective gear, such as the one-piece coating, was also becoming more common among soldiers, particularly those in armor and artillery. Then came the supply of camouflage wraps for steel helmets and gowns, following the paradigm of the Waffen-SS. But it was never enough to outfit the whole military. For elite forces on the Eastern Front, the number of special badges increased. The shoulder straps of certain grenadier regiments were decorated with special metal badges. On the right sleeve, cuff titles were worn, and at the end of the war, some units were given small metal marks to wear on their caps. New badges for uniforms were limited to rank insignia for those lacking shoulder pieces, mostly camouflage suits. Military and Waffen-SS rank badges were almost similar, except for the SS Oberfuhrer and Army Field Marshals. After that, the Nazis lost the war, but the German uniform kept on evolving. And if you want to see that, let us know in the comments below. What was it that drove the Nazis to use gas chambers to hold out one of the worst genocide operations in the history of the human race? There is no easygoing means to portray this horrifyingly brutal and atrocious historical episode. The year 1939. Unrest was about to boil over in Europe. Now that Adolf Hitler was fully in control of Germany, the Nazi Party was wielding a stranglehold over the country. Anti-Semitic speeches by Hitler and his allies led many to believing that the Jews in Germany and Europe as a whole were the root of all the nation's problems. That's why, as the Nazis took control of Germany, they started to strip Jews of their property, liberties, and legal rights. During the German conquest of Poland in 1939, Polish Jews were deported to ghettos in the country where they were isolated from the rest of the population. There were certainly more groups that Hitler sought to eradicate. In addition to those who opposed him politically, he considered that citizens like homosexuals, members of the Roma minority, and those who were mentally or physically disabled had no right to be in German society. The Nazis wanted to capture and eventually exterminate these people. But when World War II broke, the Nazis did not have a blueprint to exterminate Jews and other people they despised. And in order to execute this plan of mass murder, it meant seeking the most effective ways to carry it out. The methods changed over time, particularly from 1939 to 1941, when they experimented with a range of means. The camp commanders, particularly those in Germany and Poland, experimented with a number of ways to mass murder prisoners and shared their successes and failures with one another. It took years of work to get a single camp to the point where it could execute 2,000 to 3,000 individuals an hour. At first, mass murder was done at close range, man to man, woman, or child. In 1941, SS General Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski told his superior Heinrich Himmler that the Nazis had been murdering Jews, including women and children, at close range and in cold blood all summer. Bach-Zelewski was worried about his methods' traumatizing effects on his men. Himmler wrote down the general's worries in his diary about his soldiers, stating, "These men are done for the rest of their lives. What type of disciples are Germans making here? Nervous messes or violent thugs?" Rather than subject his soldiers to the trauma of close-quarter combat, Himmler concluded he needed to seek different means to reach the same goals. According to the memoirs of Rudolf Höss, commandant of Auschwitz, Adolf Eichmann suggested using showers of carbon monoxide while bathing, as was done with mental patients in some places in the Reich. The shower heads were not connected to sources of water. Rather, they were linked to canisters of carbon monoxide. The birth of this method had varied sources, including one ironic twist. Arthur Nebe, a Nazi killing squad commander, had come home drunk from a party one night and passed out in his garage with his car still running. The carbon monoxide gas from the exhaust nearly killed him. As he told his SS colleagues about the near miss, Nebe was convinced that gassing might be an effective weapon against Jews and other Nazi enemies. Gas would be cheaper than bullets, and no Nazi would directly take a life. So the Nazis tried out different experiments that involved using carbon monoxide. Deported Jews from the Lodz ghetto were taken through a subterranean hallway and then up a ramp to a tiny windowless chamber that turned out to be the cargo compartment of a huge van. Once the van was full, the doors were slammed shut, and as it was driven to a nearby forest, exhaust fumes were routed into the back, asphyxiating the trapped victims. When the van arrived at its site, the victims, after being removed from the vehicle, were either buried or burned. The vans, while on the way to their destinations, the sidewalkers could hear the screams, but couldn't see the people. They were loaded in and murdered there. It was a living horror. That's why they refer to these vans as Hell Vans. Though the strategy was working for the Nazis, but they wanted to be even more efficient. And Auschwitz came up with the answer. The most efficient and successful method of mass murdering at Auschwitz was based on a pesticide that was also used to remove lice from the garments of the inmates. The disinfectant, sold under the trade name of Zyklon B, was in plentiful supply. Once exposed to properly heated air, the crystals produced lethal gas. At some point in the autumn of 1941, the basement of Cell Block 11 at Auschwitz, which was the structure in which some of the most heinous forms of punishment were carried out, was walled off and locked down. August Kowalczyk, a Polish political prisoner who was sent to a nearby work assignment, saw everything that happened. He states that, since the Nazis were still experimenting, they made mistakes in their judgment, which led to the killings taking place over 2 days rather than the planned half hour. But that didn't stop them, and by the beginning of the spring of 1943, all 4 of Auschwitz II's, or Birkenau's, enormous crematoriums were running at full volume. They had 46 furnaces and 8 gas chambers, and together they had the capacity to dispose of around 4,400 bodies every single day. Trains would arrive at the camp, and those most fit, approximately 10 to 30% of the arrivals, would be selected for hard labor. The other inmates were herded into the cells that held the poison gas. SS men escorted the men, women, and children shortlisted for death to the gas chambers. Initially, to the gas chamber in Crematorium 1 and Bunkers 1 and 2, and from the spring of 1943, to the gas chambers in Crematoria 2, 3, 4, and 5. Some of those who couldn't walk were transported by trucks, while the rest went by foot. Before entering the gas chambers, these victims were asked to derobe. In Crematory 1, they disrobed either in the yard, which was enclosed by a wall, or in the antechamber. Wooden barracks were built for this purpose at Bunkers 1 and 2. And in Crematoria 2 through 5, there were special undressing rooms. In 1945, when there were a large number of transports arriving at Crematorium 5, the victims had no room to put off their clothes inside the walls, so they had to do that in the open air. To brace for their deaths, the Sonderkommando was housed within a specially constructed barracks that had been built in the Crematorium 4 undressing chamber. The members of the SS kept the individuals who were doomed to die from being informed of what was in store for them. They were told they would soon be transferred to the camp, but before that, they needed to get disinfected and take a shower. The victims were forced to strip before being led into the gas chamber, where they were then sealed in and put to death with Zyklon B gas. Following their deaths, inmates serving in the Sonderkommando were tasked with removing the bodies from the gas chambers. They took the women's jewelry and cut off their hair. The bodies were then incinerated in pits, pyres, or the furnaces of the crematoriums. Any bones that did not entirely disintegrate were crushed into a powder with pestles and then thrown, along with the ashes, into the rivers Soa and Vistula, or strewn in the fields as fertilizer or used as landfill on uneven ground and in marshes. But in May of 1944, Auschwitz had a major bottleneck, given the ongoing deportation and killing of Hungarian Jews. The Hungarian Jews were the biggest Jewish population that stayed alive in Nazi-dominated Europe, numbering around 725,000 people, plus many more who were Christian converts, but still regarded as Jews under Nazi racial criteria. They were sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau in late April and early July of 1944, where the vast majority were gassed and buried. Burning bodies on pyres behind Crematorium 5 was once again the only option for disposing of the large number of corpses that were piling up, since the camp furnaces could no longer handle the load. There was no way that the Germans could bury the dead, everyone they killed during the Holocaust, no matter how much death technology they had at their disposal. So, they blew up the gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz as they retreated from the invading Allied troops in an effort to erase any proof that could have been left behind. But the evidence lingered. In camps throughout Poland and Germany, tens of thousands of bodies remained stacked or spilling out into the cold winter snow. There can never be an accurate tally of the number of people killed in concentration camps, given the fact that those who were marched off straight from the trains were often not documented, but a figure that is reasonable and also modest suggests that at least 1.1 million individuals were put to death by gas at Auschwitz alone, with the majority of these victims being Jewish.